So we're going to start with the theory and practice of teaching and learning. And we're going to start in particular with outcomes, objectives, and goals. And these all mean different things, but I really want to start with some definitions and some perspective about the nature of learning. So I think this is a really insightful observation from John Dewey, who was an educational philosopher and psychologist, that learning is not the product of teaching. Learning is the product of the activity of learners. So what do you do as a teacher is you stand up at the front of the room, or you do some other teaching modality, and we'll talk about some of those throughout the week. But what you're doing is you're providing an occasion for people to engage their brain in a certain kind of task where they perform the learning. So it is not the case that I can cut open your heads and pour knowledge into it. You have to engage in a certain process to import that knowledge. All I can do is provide an occasion for you to learn. One of my favorite educational psychologists is Carl Rogers. And his observation, he has a number of observations that I go back to a lot about things like significant learning, which is learning that goes beyond the kind of very rudimentary kind of tasks that you might have done in elementary school or something. And so his observation is that the only person who is educated is the person who has learned how to learn. So the person that has learned how to engage in this special kind of task that adds knowledge, that recreates new structures in the brain, new ways of thinking, new perspectives. And the goal here is that this person should learn how to adapt and change, to realize that no knowledge is secure, that only the process of gaining new knowledge and seeking new knowledge gives a basis for this kind of intellectual security, right? And this is, I think, actually a very kind of radical claim, right? Because it says that things like higher education are not about somebody coming into a room and giving you a bunch of facts. It's about bringing you into a room and teaching you how to find the facts on your own, to develop your own perspectives, to see, to understand that there's a sort of gray area between true and false. And this is, of course, true in science, where we are, I think, maybe some people will disagree with this philosophy of science, but I think we are constantly trying to build a greater and greater approximation to the truth without ever reaching some final moment where we think we know everything there is to know about nature. So the questions we're going to talk about are, what does it mean to teach, and what is it that we actually teach when we engage in the act of teaching? So one definition for learning is that learning is an adaptive reorganization in a complex system. So your brain is a complex system. However it works, it's some magical connection of neurons and electric and chemical signals. It's some complex system. Learning is reorganizing that system, right? And we can abstract away from whatever the biology is to saying that the brain is encoding knowledge in some sort of structure. Here's how these structures are connected. But when we're learning, we're reorganizing those knowledge structures. We're maybe adding parts, taking away parts, building new connections between things. That's what learning sort of is. And the essence of learning is meaning. So here's this definition of this notion of significant learning that I'm a really big fan of, that significant learning is a fundamental human need. It is personal, self-initiated, pervasive, and it triggers reflection. So my claim, and I think this is a really important claim that I hope everyone will take into their lives and their careers, especially if you become a university educator or an educator in another context, is that learning is a fundamental human need. It's along with connection, eating, sleeping, whatever, right? Learning is also something that humans do because we find it intrinsically fulfilling. Humans are social animals that evolved because we had an exceptional, or maybe not evolved, but survived because we had an exceptional ability to do this one thing. And we're all constantly trying to do it. That doesn't mean that we're all always able to do it, right? Just because we have a need for something doesn't mean that need is always going to be fulfilled. And so especially when you're in a classroom, and I think I see this a lot in undergraduate classrooms, you'll have major barriers where people aren't able to satisfy this need. And one of the big things is, as an instructor, that you maybe are not responsible for, but that you should be doing to be an effective instructor, is to try and remove those barriers so that people can naturally follow their fundamental needs and desire to learn. This kind of significant learning that really goes beyond the very basic kind of need for simpler kinds of learning is personal. People take responsibility for that kind of learning. It's self-initiated. It affects their whole views and their whole reasoning abilities. And importantly, it triggers reflection. And it is this process of reflection that is core to how the brain reorganizes itself. And we'll talk more in detail about that. So as I've already said, as a teacher, I can't do this for you, right? Significant learning is something that you do. All I can do is I can facilitate and support it, but it is learners who are doing the learning. So in this kind of formal learning setting, like a classroom setting like this one, there are some big questions. So what do we want students to know and be able to do? How will we know if we've been successful at getting them to be able to know those things or to be able to do those things? And what is known about the process of learning that will help us answer those first two questions? So today, we're going to start really with these first kind of two questions, and then later in the week, we're going to go more into that third one. So you may have seen something like this before. You may have seen other things like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but there's sort of a taxonomy of learning, and there are multiple possible taxonomies. So I'm going to present the kind of three big ones that I think are especially powerful and that I have used in developing my own pedagogy. So this is probably the most famous one. It's called Bloom's taxonomy. And the idea is that this is really hierarchical. So you have a pyramid, and at the bottom are these kind of lower order thinking skills. And as you move up the pyramid, you get to these higher order, more sophisticated, more complicated tasks. So it might be something like at the bottom, it might be just remembering some specific facts. So for example, how many filters does the Rubin Observatory have? Yeah, so that is not a very high order task. You don't have to remember that number. I forget it occasionally, but that should be a simple task for you to execute in that you can respond with a single number, and that is true, basically true or false, right? Understanding, so grasping the meaning of that. Why are there six? So maybe an understanding. Actually, that might be more of a higher order question. What is a filter? Maybe is a better understanding question. What is a filter? Why do we put filters in front of the detector? Yeah.
To allow specific wavelengths of light in order to observe certain phenomena.
Yeah, exactly. We're all talking about very complicated things. So even an understanding level task is going to be fairly complicated. But yeah, that's an example of an understanding task. Applying, so using information in a new but similar situation. Why would a different telescope have a different set of filters? Why would an infrared telescope have a different set of filters, right? Would be an applying question. Analyzing, taking apart and identifying relationships, right? How would you use the fact that there are two sets of filters on two different telescopes to do something, right? Evaluating, what would be the effect of that kind of analysis that's across two different sets of filters? And then creating, which would be the highest order task, which is you're designing a telescope that's going to double the aperture. Are we going to use the same filters again? So that's the kind of Bloom's taxonomy of tasks that people would have. There's another taxonomy, which is a non-hierarchical one. So this is stressing that all of these things might be happening at once in the learning process or in the teaching process. So you might be in some aspect of what you're doing, you might be learning how to learn. You might be remembering some foundational knowledge. You might be applying that. You might be integrating it. And you might be engaging. And I think this is one of the reasons why this perspective has taken off as people have thought more deeply about what it means to learn, is you might also be engaging in interactions with other people. You might be in a discussion, for example, about whether this filter choice is better than this other filter choice, and that might affect somebody else's career progression, scientific prospects, whatever it is. They might have some feelings about that. And our brains and the way we interact with one another, we're social animals. So that's also part of the learning process and should be taken into account of. I'm giving a kind of, I think that's an artificial example because I'm trying to focus on a technical question. But I think especially when we're talking about learning things that have more of a social dimension, it becomes more obvious why these are sort of core parts of how the brain is learning to integrate new information. There's another one that I really like, which is this kind of solo taxonomy. And this is emphasizing the structure rather than the kind of complexity of the task. So you might have something that is like pre-structural, like you have an intuition about something that you might be learning about. And then you might get some very simple information that is just like a random isolated fact. Then that gets integrated into a larger set. Maybe I have a lot of new information. Then there's some relations between those new informations. And then maybe I'm extracting patterns from that collection of new information, right? So this is another taxonomy. So these are not exclusive. You can use aspects of all of them in different aspects of your teaching or how you're thinking about lesson planning. But it's good to have this kind of background of understanding what tasks have certain kinds of complexity or certain relationships with one another and how these tasks interact with each other as you're developing your pedagogy. So now that you've seen a few taxonomies, why don't you take a moment to reflect on which taxonomy has been most reflective of your own experiences as a learner, and then we'll reflect on these questions and talk about them. So let's maybe take 1 minute to 30 seconds to reflect silently, and then we'll discuss for a couple minutes, and then we'll share back. Yeah.
But it would be useful enough for this since we
Yeah.
can build that.
Yeah.
Live and put on the GitHub so we could flip through the different.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and do that while you're silently reflecting.
I always got formal grades in writing, and I was like, I just gave up. Because they were like, you have to learn cursive, and I was like, okay, like six. We just kind of ended up, but like, oh my god. Kind of.
That's when we did our.
Yeah, I can imagine that it's going to become less and less organized, depending on what I'm working on, or less coherent. It really depends. But this goes.
Yeah, if you know. The first presentation stuff.
But I've never taken like a that
Okay, these slides should now be posted so you can look at the taxonomies.
Oh, yeah. Oh, there is.
This was your.
Until you realize, especially like some of the okay. Yeah, there's.
Okay, so let's go ahead and come back together, and I'm curious how you might answer these two questions or three questions. Oh.
How about now?
Oh, okay.
Good.
Yes. Yes. Okay.
It didn't work.
Right again, Bryan.
Hello? Hoot?
You're on.
So that's the issue. Okay.
I should apologize to the owl.
Questions? Reflections? What have we learned? Out. But yes, so how would you, so just some thoughts. How might you use one of these taxonomies to design this? This is the fundamental question for today and for much of the week. So what are some initial thoughts? Yeah, Natalie.
Thinking that, like, I've seen Bloom's taxonomy before. I feel like it's one of the most useful things for creating at least like a teaching plan, or I think about it in terms of like assessment plan, like what you want out of whatever types of assessment you're giving students. The second one, the like pie chart, I felt was like harder to make an assessment plan out of, but good for understanding like the psychology of learning and how everything kind of fits together.
Yeah.
And I hadn't seen the third one, but I think it's really interesting, and again, very like good, maybe good for making an assessment plan, but maybe also like just good for understanding how the structure works.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of also my feeling, right? I think Bloom's taxonomy, I think it's a really useful organizing principle for thinking about especially assessment. And we'll talk about that on Friday, like specifically that. We'll also talk on Friday about how you use the non-hierarchical one to do assessment, which was a challenge, something that I learned about in preparing for this week. But yeah, I kind of feel like this, as we'll see, and as I present sort of my understanding of cognitive psychology, this one seems to best represent what is actually happening in the brain, whereas the other two seem like they're kind of useful abstractions that emphasize different things that can let you kind of use this background knowledge to build a course. It sounds like, did you have a thought or reflection?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I feel like this one might be particularly useful for learning coding structures, like object-oriented programming or something like that. It seems like it's starting at like the sort of base units and building.
Yeah, definitely, right. I think that's also worth emphasizing, because some of these might be better suited to some disciplines than others. Yeah.
So I feel like this might fit more into the clinic type, but one thing I find helpful when I'm starting something very new that I don't know anything about is starting with YouTube videos and like documentaries for the public and stuff like that, because I feel like they give you a just broad picture thing of this is why we're looking at this thing, and this are the types of things that exist, and they also kind of make you. They also have this part where they're trying to make people excited, so they actually give you enough time to digest that, and then if they when I, well, I see. Well, maybe this is that better, but
Yeah.
that's kind of.
Yeah, for sure. And that's also emphasizing something about significant learning, right? That it's, we want to key in on that intrinsic excitement that people have for something new and try and remove as many of those barriers. So learning from a YouTube video or something is focusing on the excitement, keeping you engaged, and removing the pretense of we are all PhD students and we need to speak in jargon and all this nonsense. Yeah.
I was kind of thinking along the same lines, kind of linking the purple section on this one and the hierarchical model as like having like foundational knowledge that's accessible in a cognitive sense, that is relatable. Having that as the foundation for the remembering or for any kind of more advanced thinking, for me at least. Like, yeah, I also get a lot of that content from like YouTube videos or from conversations I have with people rather than traditional learning environments or books. And that's always the place I build from and fall back to if I don't remember something or I don't understand.
Yeah. I also have a couple of reflections on that. I think again that keys in, and I think I chose a poor example for this of the human dimension. But our brains evolved to engage in social relationships with other people, and that's fundamental to our learning process as well, right? Our brains are not designed to build networked information of abstract mathematical concepts. Our brains are designed to hold information about social relationships, and so if you can tie abstract technical knowledge to social relationships and stories and culture and all of these things, it's learned much more deeply because that's the fundamental task that the brain does. Yeah.
I find the Bloom's taxonomy kind of harmful in the sense of the remembering and recalling specific facts. I think doing that first can become damaging to move further in someone's learning. Like if you're in a level 1 physics class and hand you a sheet of equations, and you're like, okay, I'll memorize these. You're not getting to the point of if you don't want to like learn the why because you've already been like, I'm memorizing them. I don't need to know the why. I can just use them.
Yeah.
So I think the memorizing specific facts can become harmful. So I much prefer the solo taxonomy, the defining things and like, doing simple procedures. I think throwing someone in that is helps just activate certain parts of the brain that you can do all by yourself. Whereas when remembering this.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think everything you said will hit really close to home for anyone who's TA'd or taught one of those classes. And I used to teach pre-med students. So I was teaching students who were used to, in their biology courses and in their chemistry courses, had really learned that the thing to do is to memorize. And so you ask them a question about, I don't know, some complicated pulley system, and they write a bunch of equations down that have nothing to do with the problem they were given, right? Yeah. And we'll see this. We'll see in Wednesdays, keep saying Wednesday, we're on Tuesday, double check the schedule. But in the third activity, we're going to go through and we're going to learn what this looks like in practice and how you can do what you're suggesting well and how you can do it poorly. And you'll get experience with both of those. So, cool. Any other reflections? Yeah.
Understand what is a useful skill to a certain field. Because perhaps even though they remember they've actually knowledge.
Yeah.
Whereas in physics, it's a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is another thing that I think I'm still trying to develop a perspective on, but especially in higher education, you're always learning in a specific domain. So I'll talk a little bit in some of the later slides about domain-specific knowledge. And that's an example of, it's like, I think one of the reasons, I don't know, I'm not a biologist, so I don't really know this, but I suspect one of the reasons why you remember things is because the combinations of those things have specific meanings and actually convey something that is more than just, do I remember the name of this thing, right? But how do you get to that point where you can start combining things? Well, you have to know individual parts. So I still suspect that biologists could maybe teach a little more effectively. I don't know. Yes. I did okay in my biology classes. It was chemistry I struggled with. I kind of already hinted at this. I might have accidentally put up the answer here, but maybe take 1 minute and try and answer this question, right? So this is explicitly in the context of a hierarchy. And the answer that I have in mind has to do with Bloom's taxonomy, but maybe think about how you would do it in some of the other taxonomies as well. So maybe just discuss with your neighbor what makes different kinds of higher education different from one another. Why go to graduate school?
I guess an undergraduate. I guess on like also structural, they're different, but I think that plays into it.
Okay, maybe finish up the thought. Okay, so let's just in the interest of time, let's come back together. So what are some answers to this question that you came up with? Anyone hear anything especially interesting? Yeah.
In a PhD, you're creating things, or you're meant to create things.
Yes, that is the answer that I was looking for.
Discussion over.
Yeah. So, yeah, schematically, right? Up through high school, you're learning about understanding, right? You're starting to build a rough mental model of the world. You go to an undergraduate degree. Now you're applying that in a specific domain. You're starting to analyze claims. You have a rough sense of what the big debates in that field might have been. And you're thinking about how you're going to use that to, either make some sort of academic or scholarly decisions in the long term, or something about your career. What are you going to do to excel in whatever field you end up going into? But the new thing that is unique to graduate education is that you are now making your own judgments. You are saying, actually, the debates that people have had about this thing that I learned how to analyze as an undergraduate, I have an opinion about them, and those people were wrong. I know, I figured it out. I'm the one. It's a 2,000-year-old debate. I know the answer to it. And you write a PhD saying that, and yeah, and then you continue, and if your argument is good, I guess you get to have a career. But the point here is all of you are going to be teaching a DSFP style lesson to graduate students. And so you want to be constructing that lesson with the knowledge that they're going to use what you're teaching them to evaluate claims and create new knowledge and make new arguments. You aren't teaching people the basic words that they need to know. You are teaching them to engage in a high order task that might also involve introducing some new jargon, maybe giving some history, whatever, but you're aiming at scaffolding for them, to use the word I'll use later in the week. You're aiming to scaffold for them this process of evaluating and creating new knowledge. So I think an important thing here, and again, this is something that I see, unfortunately, I see a lot of academics kind of maybe not appreciate as deeply as they should, is that these tasks at the top of the hierarchy, and I'm sure you can project this on the other models as well, are very difficult, and these are very high order tasks that require hundreds or thousands of hours of practice to get right. And nobody is able to do these tasks just like because they have a lot of talent, right? So people talk often about that person is so smart, or that person is so clever, or that person is so talented, and just naturally knows how to do these things. And that may be true. I'll discuss later in the week. There's actually cognitive science evidence both for and against that claim, right? There may be some kind of intrinsic ability to learn that some people have in different degrees of abundance in different areas. But by the time you're even teaching at an undergraduate level, that effect is totally washed out, right? All of the tasks that you're teaching in a higher education context are these very difficult, high order tasks that require people to practice, and they're difficult for all brains. So I think it's really important to recognize that if you have a student in a higher, especially in an undergraduate course, who is struggling, it's not because they don't have the ability to succeed. There's something else going on, and as an educator, it may not be your sole responsibility as a classroom instructor, but as an educator, you have some responsibility to help them to figure out what the barrier is and help remove that barrier so that they can succeed, because they have already reached a point where their intrinsic ability is adequate to be successful in higher education. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the kind of specifics of learning outcomes, goals, and objectives. So a learning outcome is what students will learn and how they will be assessed. A learning goal is what you want students to be able to do or to demonstrate at the end of a class. So an example of a learning goal is that Data Science Fellowship Program alumni will be able to employ state-of-the-art approaches to open questions in large astrophysical surveys. So at the end of your time in the program, this is what we want you to be able to do. A learning objective is what you want students to be able to do after completing a single lesson or activity. So this might be what we want you to be able to do at the end of this week. It might be what we want you to be able to do at the end of the next 30 minutes or the end of the day, something like that, but it's smaller. You're going to build up to these larger outcomes and goals with these smaller objectives. And that's sort of how you design a curriculum, is to say, we're going to do all of these things, and you'll be able to do something specific at the end of doing the first thing, and that will lead up to some larger goal. So fellows who attend session 24 will be able to describe the signal chain from photons to pixels and use this knowledge to perform image processing tasks, enabling scientific analysis. So this is obviously a very ambitious learning objective, which reflects the fact that everybody in this room is already engaged in very high order learning tasks before they enter the room, right? So this would not be an appropriate learning objective if this were an undergraduate course or this were a public outreach event, something like that. But for this audience, in this context, this is a reasonable learning objective, and it feeds into that larger goal of enabling all of you to engage in state-of-the-art scientific analyses with state-of-the-art data. So when writing learning outcomes and objectives, you should consider what the big idea of the lesson, course, or unit is. So what is one thing that learners should be able to understand or be able to do in order to benefit from whatever task they're engaged in? This came up in the discussion. What are the unique values, perspectives, methodologies, concepts that will be taught in that lesson? And so this is something that changes with every session, right? So, one of the, I guess the methodologies or the concepts for this session is going to be thinking about what is happening at the pixel level, whereas other sessions might be what is happening in this more abstract catalog level analyses or something. And what most learners already know or be able to do prior to the lesson or the course or whatever the activity is. And again, we sort of saw that in the previous slide where I already know that you all know a great deal. And so that helps us to set a different kind of objective because I thought about the audience for the DSFP. Okay, so let's move into sort of a practical framework for this. So it's important to keep things learner-centric. So when you're writing a learning objective, the subject of each sentence should be learners, not instructors, activities, or topics. This is a common mistake, right? You write a learning objective that is, maybe something like, I will teach my students to engage critically or something, right? That's not a learning objective because the learner isn't doing the active work. That was a dumb example, but there are better examples where you write, basically, if you find yourself writing in a passive voice, this is a problem because it means the learner isn't doing the thing to learn. So think who will be attending the session or attending the lesson. So you need to make sure that the people you're talking to have an investment in the material that they're receiving instruction on. So again, kind of a random example that is relevant in the moment. All of you are going to have to engage in this teaching task. So you should be at least minimally invested in the instruction you're receiving to be able to do that task. And then also what values, expectations, background knowledge, or external factors could be impacting that, right? And we start every session very intentionally by acknowledging that everybody's coming into this space with some background factors, right? But as an instructor, I've also thought about maybe what is going on? What are some travel barriers? Where are people coming from? This morning, it takes a while to get from the hotel to this room. Can we construct the morning in a way that better enables the learning objectives that we have, right? So you should be thinking about all of these things as you're writing your learning objectives and thinking about the structure of the lesson, of course. I mentioned this a second ago, you should use active and specific language. So you never want to use the words like understand and know. So what are the behaviors that indicate understanding? So one of the goals here is that when you're assessing whether the learning objectives have been met, it should be really easy to see because the person should either be doing the thing that the objective had them being able to do, or they're not able to do that. And then that allows you to adjust your instruction, provide more scaffolding, whatever the case may be, whatever you need to do to get that person able to do the task that the goal was. The related thing is consider what is the context in which the person is going to do that task. So it may be easy for you as the instructor to see if they can do the task, but can they see if they can do the task? Should also be something you're thinking about when writing a learning objective. This is this kind of classic question of when will I use this? It should be obvious to the learner when they will use the thing that they're being taught. And I've emphasized this already, but they should be measurable. So what does it mean for somebody to be proficient at a given task? Will they be able to know if they're just barely able to do it or if they're doing very well at the task? How will you know that learning has taken place? And how will the learner know that they've learned? And this big feedback loop question is, how will you know if learning hasn't taken place? So, for example, the subject of this learning objective is you all, the fellows who are attending session 24. Importantly, it's not fellows who are not attending session 24, right? There are some people who weren't able to make it. The learning objective is for those people who are in the room. The people who are not here don't have this learning objective. They have some other thing that they're doing, right? The action is not you will understand the signal chain. It is you will be able to describe the signal chain. You will be able to write in a paper that this is how your data was produced, and what you did with it as a result of that understanding. And I'll mention, when I originally wrote this learning objective, I had the word understand there. Right? It was a bad choice, and so I updated it to make it a specific task that is measurable. I can ask each of you to describe the material you've learned and assess whether you've learned it. Yeah, and I guess the second part, you should also be able to perform these image processing tasks. You should be able to write that you did it, and you should also be able to actually do it. And then the high order thing that is measurable is, are you able to do scientific analyses and infer things? So a year from now, I'm going to read your paper, and I'm going to know that you learned what you were supposed to learn by coming here this week. Yeah, so just in this kind of hierarchy, right? There are these sort of earlier tasks, we sort of talked about this. There are these tasks in the middle, and there are these tasks at the end of the learning process. So, I forget what my point was here, but I think you get the gist, right? To be able to evaluate whether people can actually do this description. You can evaluate the level of the descriptions that people are giving. Are they complicated? Are they really high level? Are they really abstract? Are they really detailed, right? You can evaluate the degree in which people are able to engage in this task. And then again, this is also a high level creative task. You are enabling scientific. This was my point. My original point here is that the SFP, we're engaging in evaluative and creative tasks. And you do this, you evaluate whether a data processing pipeline is going to give you the results you think it is, and are you going to be able to use that to create new knowledge? Okay. So we talked about non-hierarchical learning outcomes already. And so the idea here is that learners engage in all of these tasks in all or part of a lesson or a course. And I think I have an example for the DSFP. So this would be for the next session. So fellows who attend session 25, machine learning, will be able to select classical models, apply them to a new data set, and inquire about alternative approaches. You can see this is structured in a really different way, because it's saying, instead of having a hierarchy of you describe these things, you evaluate the proposed pipeline, and then use that to create new knowledge. You are now going to be doing all of these things at the same time in every task that we give you. And this actually, I think, in this week, there is kind of a hierarchy that kind of comes up. In the machine learning session, there's going to be, especially like in the hack session, there's going to be a lot of this where you're engaging in, I have this task in front of me and I have all these methods and they all have these advantages and disadvantages, and I need to be able to select the right one, remember things about them, evaluate relative costs and benefits, these sorts of things. So different kinds of learning outcomes can can be better or more poorly suited to a specific lesson or topic that you're teaching. Okay, so the summary of this talk is that learning is what learners do, and teaching is supporting learning. Again, learners are the people that are doing the learning. As a teacher, you are standing up at the front of the room, and you are embarrassing yourself in order to provide an opportunity for them to do the learning. Learning outcomes or objectives describe what learners should be able to do at the end of an activity. It should be active, learner-centered, and they should be measurable. You should know if you succeeded in achieving your learning objectives. And they should be based on the understanding of what, where learners are in a learning taxonomy. So are they undergraduates who are just encountering the material for the first time? Or are they people, PhD candidates, recently minted PhDs who are going to be out there creating new knowledge by the end of the week? And you should always meet your learners where they are. And I think I sort of hinted at this, but you should be non-judgmental in assessing where the learners are. You should not be judging people for not being where you'd like them to be. And you should also be recognizing that even if somebody is coming to you as a very fully formed scientist, researcher, scholar, professional, that there might still be things for them to learn. So you need to have a non-judgmental approach to understanding where your learners are and meet them where they are and have a sense of how to assess them. Okay. So that was all I had on this sort of first learning outcomes and objectives part. I have structured this talk over the few days so that we can just continue into the next kind of small part, but I wanted to pause here at least for some questions and maybe some discussion before jumping into this next kind of not barely, but related topic. So yeah, any questions about any of that? Yeah.
So maybe this is like something that just comes with being able to, like, as you like teach more, you learn this trait, but like, how do you like design a like lecture in a way that like brings people into it, makes them want to engage with it? Because I feel like does it just come naturally with like being intentional about the structure of the material, or is it like something else that you need to be conscientious about?
Yeah, so I think I'll touch on this more. I forget exactly how much of this I put in here, but I'm a big fan of Carl Rogers' approach to this, and he has a book called Freedom to Learn. Write that down. You should all read it. It's a great book. He was a psychologist. He was actually a clinical therapist, and he moved into educational psychology because he realized that what people were doing in therapy was the same as what people were doing in classrooms. They were changing the way that they view the world. And so he talks a lot about, at a very basic level, that people need to feel safe to engage in significant learning, because when you're changing your beliefs, your brain doesn't like that, and you have a stress and anxiety response. And if you're worried about some other thing, like people questioning your identity or physical safety or food insecurity or whatever it is, your brain can't handle the anxiety that comes with changing course. So the very first thing is that everybody in every classroom has to feel safe and welcome, and that allows them to engage in this process where they can feel like maybe I can step outside my comfort zone, learn this thing, change my beliefs, change this aspect of my identity, whatever it is that the goal of being in that classroom is. So that's the first thing. The second thing is this kind of broader question of how do you become a likable, engaging instructor that gets your students to be like want to show up for you even when it's hard. And the unfortunate answer is there's a lot of research on this, and there's no one strategy. There's no way to be the cool teacher, right? The thing that the research does show is that being authentic and being vulnerable always works. Just be yourself and be vulnerable and be open about who you are, standing at the front of the room, what your limitations are. That gets people to adjust and feel comfortable learning from you. The other thing I'll say is that whimsy is good, stories are good. Right? So one of the reasons why I included this whole thing about negative probability, even though none of you will ever use it, is I think it's a fun story, and I think it's whimsical, and I think as we're all technical people, we like weird concepts, we like chewing on them. So I can throw that in there. Maybe it has some relevance for some work that you're doing at some point. It was apparently a fairly serious idea that people did look at, but really it's to sort of get your brain to think in new ways and to become engaged. So you can include, you want to include these things. So that's kind of the three-part answer. But really it's safety, vulnerability as an instructor, and whimsy or stories. Yeah.
Advice for you're like a TA and the course that you're taking for
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think this is really tough, right? And it's tough when they're being assessed based on that objective, because I think the easy answer is if they're not being assessed, they're not being assessed on that objective, then you figure out what you think the appropriate objective is, and you teach that, right? And it's not boiling down. It's something you probably always be doing anyway. It's boiling down to that you're teaching is a really core thing that you want to take away, because that's how the objective should have been written. So you engage in this process and you teach what you think they need to know, not whatever the unreasonable expectation you give. If they're being assessed based on unreasonable expectation, it's really hard. And I think, you know, what I've done in that situation is just try to be the most supportive that I can, because they need to, your students need to trust that they can come to you and both process the unreasonableness of that expectation and be open about that so they can ask the questions that they need to ask in order to. Those are kinds of my initial reflections. I think if there's a specific scenario, it might be easier to say like, oh, do this and this and that, but kind of broadly, you need to be the resource for them needing that. And quality expectation. Not quality expectation, that's not right. Boil it down to small parts. Right? In theory, they should be able to achieve that higher, more complicated objective if they master those core parts. And as an educator, that's what you try and figure out is what are those core parts that they could take if they had resources, time, whatever it is to meet that expectation. Hopefully that helps. Happy to talk more about that one. It's a common one and it's hard. And a lot of this kind of stuff also assumes that you are the instructor of record and you get to make these decisions, which is true for the lesson that you're going to teach for us, but it's not necessarily true as you're actually teaching back in the home institution in the undergraduate classroom.
Will we talk more about the intricacy of like not being the instructor of record and like how to engage with professors on like trying to change structures?
We'll touch upon it a little bit on Friday.
Okay.
I mean, that used to be my job. So the last year of graduate school, I was employed as the person on campus whose job it was to hear from TAs about difficulties they were having with their faculty member and provide advice. So, yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is I have a lot of lived experience here, so I'm happy to have that conversation one-on-one, even if we don't cover it as a group.
You might touch on this a little later, but there was one thing that I always find a little concerning. You talked about the learning objective, setting the learning objective, what you expect students to know at the end of this session, at the end of this course, whatever. How would you assess what the student actually knows and has understood if there is a time constraint? And this is very concerning for me in particular because I have a different learning style, I have a different learning pace. And usually when someone teaches, it's impossible to incorporate every student's learning style and pace. So there's always going to be a bunch of students who connect really well with the instructor. Some people who don't. And how exactly would you, how would that fit into your evaluation of the student? Because in my experience, my master's professors would give you a very different opinion of my evaluation compared to what my graduate, but my PhD evaluators would, because in my PhD I had the chance to learn things on my own and not be subject to the classroom environment where there's just one perspective.
Yeah, so we'll talk on Friday about the difference between formative and summative assessment. And formative assessment is the thing that has to exist for learning to take place. Summative assessment is the one where that problem comes up, right? Or that problem, I should say, that problem can come up in both cases for sure, but it's summative assessment, which is about the credentialing process. So formative assessment is, you did this work, I looked at it and said, you need to learn this thing. And then we come up with some new thing or ask a question, talk about how you close the loop on formative assessment, what you do as an instructor. Summative assessment is, you took this test and I handed you a piece of paper that said you have a master's degree. Right? It's a credentialing process. Summative assessment it has a role in our society, but it isn't really part of the learning process. It doesn't mean that we don't have to navigate it, because our role as educators often includes having to deliver summative assessment, so you have to navigate the problem. Formative assessment, in theory, should be insensitive to, I should say less sensitive. It's still sensitive to it, but it's less sensitive to time constraints, because I give you a formative assessment, you give me back, I say, okay, you need to learn this thing, I hand it back to you, you learn that thing, and right, and this goes on forever. Yeah, so yeah, it's a challenge. We'll talk more about it. Right, I think I will leave this for the next pedagogy lecture, so we have 3 minutes left. Maybe I can, with 3 minutes, maybe I can at least have this conversation. So we'll do this. Why don't we talk about this question for a second? I feel like 3 minutes is enough time for us to answer this definitively. Discuss with your neighbor, and we'll
Or I guess in like I guess it doesn't define what it is. Whatever they think it is, it's like this person's yeah, it seems like that would have been good to know, right? It's something like just think that it's like I don't think it's gonna.
Okay, so let's come back together and let's have a 1 minute discussion of this question. So are there any answers that people are eager to share about what knowledge is?
I think we were having a discussion about how like what knowledge is has kind of changed, but universities haven't necessarily brought up. So I can't remember the name of the model you were discussing earlier, the empty vessel deficiency model. Right, the idea that you knowledge is like you fill someone's mind with that.
Yeah, right. You have to open their head.
Yeah.
Knowledge.
This is like a challenging, hard time like idea of like what you need of facts.
Yeah.
And I think that we're way past that, and we see that evidence in like any class that you TA, or at least my experience, like students, the moment you set them to work, ChatGPT right away. And unfortunately, the university assessments are still geared towards that, like it rewards that behavior, rather than recognizing that knowledge these days is more in kind of second or third order products in terms of analytical thinking, and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I'll just, this is not related specifically to what knowledge is, but the issue with ChatGPT in higher education, specifically related to this summative assessment and prevention process, is that large language models allow students to mimic the signs that learning is taking place without actually doing the learning, right? And so it destroys this formative versus summative assessment. And one of the problems is that responses to this have been focused on summative assessment. Okay, we're going to have in-class exams, handwritten, no resources, whatever. It's great for summative assessment, but as an educator, I don't actually really care about the credentialing process. I care about formative assessment, which requires students to engage in this very costly activity of learning and getting things wrong and showing me how I'm doing that. And if they've ever done that before, I haven't had this experience because LLMs were post my TA experience, but certainly there are students now who have gone through a year or two of high school without ever having to demonstrate learning or engage in the learning process. They get to college and they don't know how to do it. So yeah, that's a relevant and very practical answer. In the interest of time, I'm going to read Mona's answer because it gets at a lot of where this conversation is going to go later in the week. But there are a lot of other answers, and this is an interesting question. I hope we'll have more time to talk about. Mona says, knowledge is the understanding and awareness gained through experience, education, or discovery, consisting of facts, concepts, and truth that help us to interpret and interact with the world. And I actually think that's basically the right answer. That's the answer that I'm going to give in the rest of this talk, is how do you develop that through all these different aspects, specifically in terms of interacting with the world. So ultimately where we're going is how do you learn how to solve problems? And the brain engages in a very particular kind of process and has a particular kind of structure that enables these interactions both to happen within the brain and externally in order to do things like science. So, cool. I think we are 2 minutes, 3 minutes behind. So let's come back at 11:03 and we'll get started with image processing and astronomy. So, yeah.